In the old days, the people that had not read would try to take over the discussion.
And they shall remain nameless.
They shall
But
remain.
we know you mean. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thank you so much for coming.
And I think I'll ask you the question just to start that I'm sure you have been asked many times. Have you read all of these books?
You know, I hate that question. I keep telling people that collecting books is one hobby, reading books is a separate hobby. I collected thinking that when I retired, I would have the option to come and read all of these books. If they weren't available at that time, I would have them ready for me. And that was a lie, because when I retired, I did promise myself I was going to reread all of Octavia Butler, because I love Octavia Butler. I retired in 2008, and I've not reread even one of her books yet. So I'm letting that go. I'm sure Octavia will understand.
Mm-hmm.
But
that is a question that people who don't collect books always ask people who do collect books, I think.
Also people that don't read.
Right.
Correct.
Yes. So let's start at the beginning. Why don't you tell us about where you grew up, a little bit about your family.
I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, pronounced Louisville, Kentucky,
Mm-hmm.
unless you're putting on airs, and I don't want to put on airs, so let me say I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. My parents were Willer and Mary Banks. I had one older brother, Charles. When I was born, my parents had recently moved into a new housing project, Shepherd Square. And it was interesting because back during that time, it was just about always two-parent households that they would be allowing into the projects. Mm-hmm. And it was actually a step up for black people to be able to get in a housing project. And there were two for black people, Shepherd Square and Beecher Terrace. And I had an aunt and uncle that lived in Beecher Terrace.
So Louisville is home.
Mm-hmm.
What are your earliest memories about books and reading, or how old were you when you learned to read?
I always loved to read. And one of my earliest memories was sitting on Daddy's lap, and he turned to Jesus Wept, and I read it. I must have been around 3, and you would have thought I had invented the printing press because my daddy was so proud, and I thought, this reading, it must be something to this.
Mm-hmm.
Both of my parents read to me and my brother. And my most joyful memories are sitting on my daddy's lap being read to. It would either be a storybook or the Bible. And Mother used to read the comics to us. We would be lying on the bed, Charles on one side, me on the other side. And he would get very frustrated if Mother started dozing off. And it would crack me up. Then in Louisville, then, to go to first grade, you had to be 6 by January 1st.
Mm-hmm.
My brother was 6 on January 6th. So she put him in school a year early because she didn't see where the 5 days would make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
he did very well. I think he was better adjusted than I was. But when they would be hearing his lesson, after they finished, they would have to hear my lesson. And of course it was look, 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 see, see, see. And Mother would get kind of frustrated because I would be looking out the window reading, and she would be trying to convince me, Joanna, if I'm going to hear you read, you have to come and look at the words.
Ah.
You know, mothers can be really particular about some things. You know, and I didn't, the next year, it's time for me to go. But I was not going to be 6 until March 28th. Mm-hmm. So it's a big difference in those few months. Mm-hmm. I was not ready to go to school. I did not want to go to school. Mother negotiated that, okay, I could read, but I couldn't write, and I couldn't count my money. So I thought, those are some pretty good reasons. I'll go to first grade. Mm-hmm. At the end of first grade, Miss Thruston taught script, and I had a hard time making that J. But by the end of first grade, I knew how to write Joanna Banks. I knew how to count my allowance, which was 10 cents. I could count 2 nickels, 10 pennies, a nickel, and 5 pennies, and I recognized the case dime. I thought my education was over. I had accomplished the goals that I set out for. Mother said I had to go to second grade. She lied to me. I had enough sense not to say, Mother, you lied to me. But I never really adjusted to school. I never liked school.
But you loved reading.
I loved reading, loved learning, did not like school.
And so what were some of the earliest books that you remember as a child?
Well, the only book that ever had a black character in it was Little Black Sambo. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of surprised that my mother actually borrowed that from the library. Mm-hmm. One of my proudest moments was when I got my own library card. I felt this is special.
And the libraries in Louisville were desegregated?
No, they were segregated.
So to a black neighborhood library?
Yes, mm-hmm. Yes. The only other book that, or story that I really remember was The Ransom of Red Chief. I think that was O. Henry. Mm-hmm. And I also liked Homer Price. I guess I liked Bad Little Children.
Why do you think that is?
I guess I identified with their behavior. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was really cool that the kidnappers had to pay to get the boy back to his family. Mm-hmm. You know, I thought that's how you handle that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. So when did you leave Louisville, and how did you end up in Washington?
I left in 1964, and I left Louisville because of Louisville. I've adapted so much to being here. But needless to say, it was very difficult for a black person to get a job if you were not willing to clean a white woman's house. And I was very clear to my parents that they would be taking care of me forever because I was not going to do that. Mm-hmm. but there were opportunities to go to the post office and take exams for federal government in Washington. So I did that, and when I was a few months from being 21, I came to Washington, D.C. to work for the Bureau of Public Debt, where I worked for 1 year.
And then what did you do? Oh, I don't mean that. That's how you came to be in Washington. That's enough. That's enough.
Well, I didn't really like working
At all.
at all. I didn't like working any more than I liked school, but I adapted to work life a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
I quit the Bureau of Public Debt to return to Louisville, and I even mailed all of my books, because I collected then, but not black books, just books, and I sent them by Greyhound. Before I could get the Greyhound back to Louisville, Mother started mothering me, or smothering me, and I decided I can't return. I got out. I'm staying out. And AT&T was hiring, where I worked for the next 22 and a half years. I was in the first round of downsizing in 1987. So that ended my Bell System career, which was rather traumatizing for me, because I had never been out of work. But the deal was I got a year's pay and all benefits for a year. And I started volunteering at the Anacostia Museum,
Mm-hmm.
where eventually I was given some part-time temporary positions and eventually taken on full-time,
Mm-hmm.
which is where I ended my work career.
And what did you do at the Anacostia Museum?
I was a museum educator.
And so you were doing exhibits or working with public or children or what?
Working with the public and children, concentrating on women's history and children's literature.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the Dr. George Washington Carver Nature Trail,
Mm-hmm.
which is the main reason Zora Martin Felton hired me, was to put an African American overlay on the nature trail,
Mm-hmm.
which I thought very interesting, because the first day I went out there on the trail and I thought, what does this lady want me to do with this dirt and these leaves? But I did create an underground railroad walk for the trail,
Mm-hmm.
which Quayle Smith took and she worked it. She did a couple of, probably 3 or 4 trail walks as Harriet Tubman, and it was wonderful. But I did the research, and she took my research and developed it into something really special.
Okay. So when you think about the books that you have collected, when do you think you began to collect rather than simply to buy?
I started collecting in 1965 with the Langston Hughes Reader, and I'm trying to spot it, but that was a Book of the Month Club book. And reading Langston Hughes, I felt I need to find more writing like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the passion for collecting started, because it was wonderful having to research who are the black writers. And there was a used bookstore on Pennsylvania Avenue, Estate Books. And it was so thrilling to go in there and find a book by a black writer. I felt like just so happy. And of course, the passion for collecting kind of ends when you don't have the chase.
Mm-hmm.
When you can go on Amazon or Borders, or, and of course, that's another kind of wonderful, like Drum and Spear bookstore, the first black bookstore, oh, excuse me, in D.C. I really enjoyed going there. And later, Vertigo, which was not a black bookstore, but they certainly supported black writers. And before Vertigo, there was Common Concerns.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess I really kind of stopped calling myself a collector a few years ago because as a collector, I was trying to buy, if it was by a black writer, I had to have it. And then I became more discriminating about, I don't have to have every black writer.
Right.
It's going to have to be a book that I at least plan to read when I retire. No, I'm probably not going to take it home and read it now, because I would buy 5 to 10 books at once. So of course I'm not going home to read all of them, but
I wanted to go back to something that you said a few minutes ago, because you make a really good point about what it was like to actually shop in bookstores, which are now few and far between, and that was actually also part of the experience of buying and collecting.
yes,
Was the experience of actually frequenting those bookshops.
yes.
Yeah.
And I miss that. Although Amazon in some ways makes it easier, because I don't have to ask the merchant to try and order something for me.
Mm-hmm.
If I hear about a book and I go to Amazon, I will have it within 2 days. But the thrill is gone because it's too easy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The other thing about being in Washington, I think, has to do with not just buying the books, but being able to see black writers.
Right.
And so you've been able to do that too here, or?
Did a lot of that when Vertigo was in DuPont Circle. I did a lot of that when Llama's Books and More was in that area. I haven't been to a book signing in a long time, but that was a part of the thrill. As meeting other people that want to talk about books.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And didn't you used to go to the conferences at Howard?
Yes.
So what, describe that for us?
Howard did an annual conference where they invited probably 20 different writers for different panels. And I would go every year, I've taken a lot of photographs from those conferences. And that too was very thrilling, to get to meet the writers and to get books signed and things like that.
Mm-hmm. And the other institutions in Washington that would bring in writers would be the Library of Congress.
Right. And I'm blanking on the name, but the one that concentrates on Shakespeare. Folgers, yes. I
I saw Audre Lorde at the Folger Library.
Interesting that you mentioned Audre Lorde. She was at Llama's Books and More, and I took all of her books to be autographed. And she said, "This is the first time I've ever seen all of my books in one place. So she autographed each of those books for me.
And did you get to meet Octavia Butler?
I did.
Tell us about that.
Octavia Butler was invited to the Smithsonian, and I had the arrogance to think that I would be the only one with all of her books, and there must have been 200 other people in line with all of her books. And when I got to her, because she was trying to personalize every book, I said, if you just write your name and the date. And she said, oh, thank you. Because there was still more than 100 people wanting to have her autograph their books.
So are there other writers that you met that you remember and that you particularly enjoyed meeting or seeing speak?
J. California Cooper was very entertaining. As a matter of fact, when she was at Llama's Books and More, and I worked part-time there,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not for sure how it came about. She wanted to meet other black women. So I invited her to my house, and I called and had other people get on a telephone chain to call the women in our book group. And she came here and she told stories for hours. She even took and dressed in another smock that she liked using for her storytelling.
A change of costume.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. But you've seen many black women writers.
Yes.
Almost Alice Walker. You've seen.
Yes.
Mhm.
And I have a very interesting photograph of Alice because she was at Llama's, and I was taking a lot of photographs of her. When I had them processed, there was one where she was giving me the side eye meaning she was sick of me, and I hadn't thought that she only had sight in one eye.
That's true.
And I guess with the camera flashing in that one eye, and later I did apologize. I showed her the photograph and I said, I'm so sorry. And she said she forgave me.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Don't want Alice Walker to.
Be mad at you.
Mm-hmm.
Barbara Neely, who wrote Blanche on the Lamb, and then she did, I think, 2 other Blanche books. She was a fantastic storyteller in print.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Dolores Kendrick, who wrote The Women of Plums.
Mm-hmm.
That book moved me probably more than any other book ever had.
Mm-hmm.
Lucille Clifton. My favorite poet would be between Dolores Kendrick and Lucille Clifton. A lot of appreciation for both of them.
Are you you're a Toni Morrison fan, aren't you?
I love Toni's early work. I have found it more challenging to read her later work. That's not on Toni, that's on me. But Beloved was my absolute favorite, and I know some people struggle with that. And I say, when you're reading Toni Morrison, you need to let go of your world and accept Toni's world. The same with Octavia Butler. If you want your world, stay in your world. If you want to expand your world, read Toni Morrison or
Mm-hmm.
Octavia Butler.
Mm-hmm. So what writers do you regret never having been able to meet or see or talk with? Or were you able to see all of them?
The person I most wanted to meet was Octavia Butler. and I've seen her maybe 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
I still grieve her death because that means I don't get another book by Octavia Butler. A male writer that I really love, other than James Baldwin. Of course, I love James Baldwin, and I did get to photograph him at one of Howard's Writers' Conference, is Edward Jones.
Mm-hmm.
His writing, I think, is magical. And Edward doesn't start writing until he has a story told in his head. And I want to call him and say, Mr. Jones, I'm 75. I need another book. You don't have that much longer. Please give me another book. But I guess he'll do it in his time.
So you mentioned the women's reading group, which is how we met.
Correct.
But tell us about how that group started.
I think I saw a notice in Pyramid Books on Georgia Avenue, and we met one Saturday or Sunday at the library. The two people starting the group was Lois Alexander and Michelle Smith. I don't remember how many people came to that first meeting, but Diane Simpkins was there, and she is one of my longest friends, longtime friends. And Michelle and Lois called it the Black Women's Arts Resource Collective because they were thinking of developing a group that would look at various types of art, the theater, film. Diane and I, being older and probably strong-willed, decided we wanted a reading group. So Michelle, who was also strong-willed, was going to leave soon, and I'm blanking on the name that. Okay, I forget. She was leaving, and it left Lois to deal with me and Diane.
Outnumbered her.
Yes, and the first book that the group read was Things Fall Apart. And after that, I think Diane and I decided that we wanted to concentrate on books by Black women. So it was a matter of discovering who the Black women were that were writing. And I'm pretty sure that from there we went to Zora Neale Hurston. I'm not for sure.
Mm-hmm. And so that was 1984. 1984.
Yes.
And that group's still alive in some way?
It's
Should we ask
limited.
the question differently? And how long did that...
No, the group is still going. I can't say going strong. There are about 8 sometime members of the group. At one point, the group had 35 or more members, which is way too many for a reading group. Now that we're about 8, it really makes for a better discussion if everyone reads the book. And that's a big if.
So your book collecting then followed your own interests, and so you then began to collect more Black women's stuff?
Yes. Yeah. All of the books on this side of the room belong to Black women, as do most of the books on the bottom shelf. And I had to move the men up there because the women took over 3 shelves here. And it's been a challenge because it used to be when everything was well organized, it was a more relaxing space than with books piled on top of books. And the fact that I really would have liked to have kept all of the women together, but there was no space other than doing what I did. Yeah.
And so, in addition to those books, you've also collected other kinds of books.
Yes. Black cookbooks.
Tell us about how you started to do that.
Well, even as a little girl, I liked collecting recipes, but I also liked cooking when I was a child. And every month, Mother had to buy me Woman's Day and Family Circle, and I would tear recipes out, and I created a scrapbook that I still have. And then in the mid-60s, people started talking about soul food. And that was a new term to me, because I had an aunt who was a terrific cook. She never said she cooked soul food. My mother was a good cook. She never cooked soul food. So I started trying to find some reference materials. And Ebony had done a cookbook. And there was another cookbook called The Negro Chef. And the first black cookbook I was able to purchase was Princess Pamela's Soul Food Cookbook. It only came out in paperback, and I still have a copy of that. More recently, they've reprinted it as a hardback. And Tuesday Magazine, which used to be a magazine that came with the Sunday paper, they publish a soul food cookbook. And from there, I was off to the races, trying to find black cookbooks. And of course, it was very challenging for a number of years. But now that's not so much of a challenge. Although I will say that I still collect black cookbooks, and I will continue to collect black cookbooks. And after I accumulate a few, I will send them to the University of Pennsylvania. Because I've never used cookbooks to cook out of. When I was younger, I would follow recipes. Then pretty much I cooked the way I saw my mother cook. And now there's Pinterest, so if there's something I thought I wanted to cook, I would go to Pinterest and call up the recipe. But if there's something I think I would like to cook, I can't go through 400 cookbooks trying to find a recipe for it.
And what else do you collect? Books?
Children's books. As I said, the only children's book I ever saw a black character was Little Black Sambo. And when my niece and nephew were born in the mid-60s, I wanted to find books for them. And I did send them books that had black kids illustrated. But I continued to collect for myself. And I wonder if those books had been available to me when I was a little girl, what difference it would have made. I can't imagine that I would love books anymore. But there's one called I'm a Pretty Little Black Girl. And Thunder Rose and Kadir Nelson does beautiful illustrations, as do the Pinckneys. And they're wonderful. The, the books are so beautiful. Uh, I'm really happy that black children have an opportunity. And I guess my favorite children's book is Flossie and the Fox. Flossie's a little black girl, lives in the country. The fox is very erudite, using very firm, correct English. And Flossie messes with the fox. She's smarter than the fox. And I love this story.
She outfoxes the fox.
Yes. And for a while, when I was at the Anacostia Museum, I was working with Mary Gadsden, who did a program at Our Lady of Perpetual Help Church, a Catholic church up the street. And a couple of summers, I had reading groups with her girls called Brave Black Girls, where we had Flossie and the Fox and Thunder Rose and quite a few other books that I could find that featured black girls taking care of business. Yeah.
You also collect art,
I do.
and what's your interest there, and how did you start doing that?
Okay, I started collecting art in 1968. I was dating this guy, and I'm not going to try and remember his name because it wasn't important then. It's certainly not important now. But he was an art collector, and he got me started because I was very naive about art then. I had this, what I considered a beautiful cityscape in shades of peacock blue and emerald green, which was the color scheme of my apartment. And he helped me learn you do not buy art based on your color scheme. I didn't know. We only know what we know. What we don't know, we're ignorant about. So he introduced me to an artist, Sterling Heights, and I bought an original piece by him, although it is in shades of blue and green. Couldn't make the jump too quick. Then I bought one of his portraits of an African woman, and then I knew I had to start collecting original African American art.
But you're an artist yourself, too. I would say, or you create. You create.
I thank you. And one of the questions I like to ask people when I meet them new is, what is your art? Because I figure we're all artists, whether it's a garden or cooking or quilting or sculpting or doll making, we're all artists. I can kind of claim that I'm a black doll artist.
Yes. And how did you start to do that?
Have to go back some. When I was a little girl, the only dolls I ever had were white dolls. When I was about 4 or 5, I asked my mother for a colored doll. My mother really tried to give me and my brother whatever we asked for. So she went to this hardware store, Five and Dime something, and she asked the white merchant if he had a Negro doll, because she didn't use the term colored. That was my term. If he had a Negro doll for her little girl. And he said, of course, follow him. And I can remember being so excited. I'm going to get a doll that looks like me. And he shows us an Aunt Jemima doll pushing a white baby in a buggy. And my mother wrapped her robe of righteous indignation about her and said, I wouldn't buy that for my child. And we marched out of the store. I quit asking for dolls. I continued to get white dolls. In 1978, Toys R Us, in a Sunday ad, had a black boy doll, anatomically correct. One of my co-workers, Joseph Daniels, went and bought the doll for me. I took the doll home and showed it to Mother, because I'd also asked for a boy and a girl doll before I asked for a colored doll. And she didn't do well with that either, because as soon as I got the boy doll away from her prying eyes, I checked to see if he checked off like my brother, who was a year older, and she bathed us together. I could not say once again, or for the first time, Mother, you lied to me. But here was, wrapped in one doll, an anatomically correct black doll with features like mine. So that started my doll collecting. At the museum, one of the programs I did was to invite Francine Haskins to do a doll workshop. And that's when I started making dolls. But that's when I started making dolls, and that's when I started collecting art dolls. There were several magazines that showed collectible dolls, $3,000-$4,000. I knew that was above my collecting. So I had to develop my own skills as a doll artist if I wanted to keep upping the game, for the dolls I collected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how many dolls do you think you own, approximately?
Approximately 400, 450.
And are you still collecting? You're still making?
No, I thought that when I retired 10 years ago that I would start making several dolls per month. I think in the 10 years I might have made 2 or 3 dolls.
Mm-hmm.
That passion just went away.
Mm-hmm.
I will buy a doll, but it'd have to be like she's crying to go home with me.
Yeah.
They have their own room. Many of them are in the closet because I don't have room to do them. And I am looking for a permanent home for them also.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about, or the decision to donate your collection, has that been a difficult decision for you, or how did you come to that? Did you reach that decision or make that conclusion?
I started thinking that I had really tried to be a good steward of this book collection.
Mm-hmm.
That the chances that I would figure out a way to take them with me would not be good, because don't want them to burn. Not saying I'm going there, but I realized that I needed to figure out a home for them. And of course, my good friend Barbara Savage, several years ago, I appealed to her to help me make a decision as to finding a home for my for my books. And I really do thank you, Barbara.
Well, it's an honor. How do you and how do you imagine and how do you want the books to be used?
I hope that they will be a part of a reference,
They
not a
will.
lending
They will.
library.
Yes, they'll be part of a reference library. Yes.
Okay. I see my collection as separate collections. There's a women's collection, there's a children's collection, and then there's the cookbook collection, and then the general collection. It would be good if they could be displayed as those separate collections. Yeah. But one of the things I've been telling myself, Joanna, you're giving them to University of Pennsylvania. That means you have to let go of control. But I feel certain that my wishes will be respected as far as what the university can do. Because I worked for a museum for so many years, I do know that people can give up a collection and it may not follow what the donor exactly wanted.
But in this case, that will happen. Are there any other? Is there anything else that you would like to say, or make sure it's on the record?
I think we have covered it, Barbara. Anything else you've been wanting to ask me for the last 34 years?
Not
Would
on,
you like-
not on camera.